Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A couple of clarifications at the start of my speech, right? We believe that this machine is one which broadly is going to tell people what sort of morality one person opts into and what their moral beliefs and stuff like that are. But this means, notice that the term here says universal moral systems. That means moral differences that are oftentimes based on certain social norms or religious norms are not going to be assessed here. We believe this is important because oftentimes people do sometimes differentiate between small social norms, and judging a person based on that can sometimes be problematic, which looks like if you believe in the Asian norm of being like really patient or not, or if you focus on yourself rather than the community or not. We believe these things in general are not going to be assessed inside these residential like evil machine. We believe universal moral principles are going to be assessed, which means morals which are accepted by all, such as you should not opt into like domestic violence, or you should not kill people, you should not be a thief, etc. And secondly, we believe this in general is likely to be accurate. The reasoning for this is that the experiences the person goes through feels completely real to them, meaning even if they know this sort of test exists, when they're directly going through the test, they're unable to differentiate if this is real or if this is not, which means the like decisions they're likely to take is going to be reflective of the ones that they take under real world circumstances, right? What this means is oftentimes the results are going to be pretty accurate to like reflect what the morality of that person is. And just finally, on one another note, is we think that since this machine exists, it's not going to be like that you can only opt into this test once. Obviously, people have changing moralities which reflect the situation he's going through or the experiences that he has. We believe this can be flexible and a person can take this sort of like test multiple times, right? That being said, why is our world likely to be better? 3 things. Firstly, why you have better social connections. Secondly, why you have better forms of reform. And finally, why you have better representation and policy making. Oh, all right, on the first, recognize the way we make social connections in our world is by directly engaging with people and knowing them through a lot of situations. This means that since people do not have epistemic access into the other person's mind, i.e. not knowing what they think or how they react under what situation, the only way you can really know people to an extent is by directly engaging to them for a extended period of time and seeing that person under various sorts of moral situation. By doing this, you understand what these things this person is likely to believe in and what this and how this person is likely to react. We believe oftentimes this is ineffective because you can't really engage to this person on a permanent basis, which means a lot of times you don't really know a lot of situation that person might be going through or the decisions that they may be making. But secondly, you're always seeing this from a neutral lens, which means you don't really understand the direct situation, like direct decision makings that this smart person can have. We believe oftentimes the judgment can also be subjective, meaning you don't necessarily understand if that person is right or not wrong, because you might have certain biases towards them or certain preconceived notions about them, which means people don't really have a lot of like good ability to assess people in the first place. We believe in our world, since these are more like universally accepted norms and these are publicly available, at least people in general have better access to them. This means people in general know what the other person might want or what sort of choices the person might make under certain circumstances. We believe therefore people are more able to assess these forms of relationship that they interact with and therefore have better relationships. The impact of these are threefold. Firstly, we think you just have better trust and therefore are able to have better happiness in our world, because in the current status quo, you don't really know if the belief that you have about the person is accurate or not, and therefore you're likely to doubt that person more, meaning you can't really trust them and therefore you lack the happiness that can be gained from this. At least in our world, you have an objective metric to assess, which means you can have better trust and better happiness as a whole. But secondly, we also believe there is just lesser sunk cost in our world, meaning you don't necessarily need to waste a lot of time in understanding what that person might be like or if they might be harmful for you. Therefore, you don't really need to cross check your relationships a lot more, which means oftentimes oftentimes you don't need to be at the sunk cost. This looks like you engaging with a person for 5 years and then understanding that this person is probably really bad, but not being able to come out of the relationship because you've invested so much. In our world, you don't invest so much, and therefore you can obviously come outside more easily. This means you have better friendships and relationships in our world, and we believe therefore you also have like better parenthood and better engagement to your children and stuff like that. We will do a little preemption here of the opposition case. The only thing that they can say is probably you have stigma towards people who have a lesser moral, lesser moral understanding or do not abide by these morals in general. We believe this is still better in our world, because even in the status quo, people have preconceived notions about them, about people, but the way that manifests is through the direct identities people have. This means you have biases against certain forms of religions and ethnicities where you think that these people are just directly bad. At least in our world, you assess people in an objective way, which means not only are your judgments more accurate, but secondly, we protect vulnerable minorities who are likely to be like subject to these sort of like biases in the current status quo. Therefore, our world has better relationships. Before I proceed, I'll take the COPOI.
In your mechanism, you stated that you are not going to assess religious and cultural values. The question becomes, why do you think racism is going to more likely disappear on your side, especially when those kinds of culture isn't quantified in the test anyway?
Yeah, so I think racism doesn't necessarily mean you assess that person based on culture. You also assess that person based on the universal morality that you perceive, and you just think these are people who likely does not abide by them. In our world, at least you have an objective metric to assess if that person abides by that, and therefore you have betterment for them in general, right? Secondly, on rehab, recognize that oftentimes the problem with status quo is you don't really understand what sort of people have criminal tendencies, and therefore the harms that they might cause to society are oftentimes unchecked. At least in our world, since these are publicly available and people just know about them more, you have better chances of understanding which people are bad and creating rehab for them. This means you understand the amount of people in your society that needs rehab and the form of rehab that they need, and therefore you can just create better rehabilitation facilities for them through which they can reintegrate into society better. With this also means you have better like situation for people in general, because you don't directly create harms on humans to begin with, or you don't need harms to assess if that person is bad or good, which means you don't have people who are directly harmed, but secondly, you don't directly jail people, which comes with a lot of cost. You just focus more on reintegration. Finally, a bit on policy, because I think you're now able to assess politicians more based on the level of understanding that they have and the level of like faith they are going to show to their promises, and therefore we just think you get better representation in our world. Jumana will extend on this, very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for
panel, what we want to stand for in opening the position is the fact that morality for individuals isn't just a stable line. It's something that can change. It's something that you can be within of. When you create this type of test, even if you take it 1,000,000 times, if one of them turns out that you're a bad person, society is going to label you as such with no opportunity of you making a change in that perception, both for yourself and for society. 3 things in my case. First of all, why people will buy into this like label that this game gives you. Second of all, how this will harm your personal image. And third of all, how it will lead to irreversible discrimination. But before that, a bit of a bubble. First thing we hear from OG is the fact that this will lead for better connections. We think that this is highly unlikely. First of all, let's challenge the idea that people aren't critical enough in order to understand who is good for them and who is bad. We think that like people have enough like critical understanding to understand when they're in a toxic relationship, to understand when someone within their surrounding is harming them. But even if they don't, we think that becomes worse under their side. Why? Because the problem in not understanding is based on a confirmation bias about the narrative that you have concerning if someone is good or bad. When you have a specific label, you tend to buy into that because you have this authority telling you that this person is good or this person is bad. When you have, for example, a good label, you tend to think that, sure, I can blindly trust this individual, which leads to worse decisions. So in a case in which you're in a relationship and you feel like there is some form of toxicity, you tend to think that, look, the test said that this person is good, so probably I'm judging something wrong, which means that you're less likely to break that tie that open government tells you that are difficult in the world that they're defending. If they're bad, this becomes even worse because you don't give even the opportunity to those people for you to get in contact with them. And we think that generally, because morality isn't something that is black or white, people that make a bad decision doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take that bad decision again and again, which means that when you highlight that, oh, maybe someone stole something, you tend to be extra careful around them and be afraid that they're going to harm you, which means that you don't give to this person the opportunity either to have stable friendships, either to have a good job. So we think of the comparative when we have so many people harmed just because the test said that they were bad and not being able to have those stable relationships. We think that this is more irreversible harm than having some like lack of trust into having to dive into more in-depth in a relationship. Second thing they tell us is that you're going to protect people from like criminal tendencies and you're going to increase rehabilitation. Attention here. We think that when you have this result being published by something that people think that it is a generic authority, you tend to follow it blindly, which means you tend to believe that these people, because they made this bad decision, are not going to change. This is what the system told you. This is what their fate is, which means that the likelihood of you trying to find rehabilitation mechanisms are not very high because you have the bias that these people are not likely to change, which means that this is more likely to have the people like being in the authority like of the police, having someone that might commit a crime but imprison them even if you don't have the perfect evidence. That makes even the justice system being even more correct because you tend to judge people based on something that they could have done instead of their actual actions. But why do they necessarily buy into these narratives? Because we think people will not be interesting enough to look into the precision of the decision that you made into that virtual reality. We think that they're less likely to understand the circumstances that someone went through because you get a label that they tells you that, oh, because you have limited time, you won't go into searching for everyone and see whether they're bad or good or whether the test was correct. You'll just take it into blindly. Second of all, because the test itself is going to create the sense of authority, since it's kind of always right, why should I try for something different? And third of all, because the people that have a result will have no mechanism of explaining their actions, because people will have this entrenched idea that, oh, look, it was this ultimate virtual reality that decided your fate. When you create that, the first harm you're creating is for the people themselves. So those people you take away, you infringe this right of them having the ability to use the life they decide. No, thank you. This looks like internalizing the results that you got. When you have a good result in one case, you believe that you're a good person, which means that you're more likely to try to draw through the lines because, like, the test told me I'm good. The society thinks I'm a good person. So even if I go slightly over the line, I'm still good at heart. That impacts even more the idea that relationships are going to become even worse because people will again trust blindly that, oh, it was a result, so one mishap doesn't really matter. When you're having a bad result, you have this idea in your mind that you're a bad person, which means that you're not worth of having a chance into progressive, a chance into rehabilitating, a chance into changing. That minimizes the agency you have on your decisions because you feel like your fate is sealed. You feel like no matter what happens, neither you nor the society is going to change their perception, which means that in the end, you feel that you're irredeemable of the choices that you made in the past. You think that the test has already decided on you, so you put less emphasis into making correct decisions and agent decisions into your everyday life because you have the internal confirmation bias that I know that I'm a bad person. Closing government, do you have a POI? Opening government.
Yeah, so the reason why you have toxic relationships in your world is because of sunk cost. You know the person is bad, but since you've made so many investments, it's really hard for you to come out. In our world, you have an objective evidence of his morality, and therefore you don't need to make those investments to know him in the first place. Please engage.
Cool. We think when you see a good label, you invest even more because you think, sure, I'm safe. And when something goes back, you continue staying in that relationship because you have the confirmation bias that in the end they're a good person. And in the other case, when you see someone as a bad person, you don't even take the time to give some emphasis on how they look, which means for those persons themselves, which we think are more likely to be a bigger number of people that will not even get the opportunity to see who they are, something that is irreversible, something which like affects them in a higher percentage than just giving them a chance and you getting hurt. But how this is going to look for the society? We think that when you get a good result, like the society will have this idea that there is no way for you to change your ability, who you are. We think that this will increase like the intense discrimination that you have for people, label them as a specific minority. So for example, in cases where you see one Muslim taking a bad decision, the idea that you have entrenched that maybe all of them are terrorists, which is extremely racist, is going to get confirmed. When you see one person from a lower economic background staying, you think that all of them are dangerous. This creates a huge problem with society, not trusting each other, not like putting this faith that someone can change, someone is able to make changes in the circumstances. Because we think that this mechanism is bad for the perception that you have from yourself and for the way that society sees you, we beg you to vote with opening opposition. Thank you.
I think the leader of opposition.
She opinions that case, then overruns exactly the case of stigmatization and how leveling people will be so bad. So far as in the existing world, when this kind of evil machine or VR machine do not exist, we still label people and still stick to the beliefs that we have for a certain person. Still in our side of the world, we are actually objectively or universally assessing them, just not based on the subjectivity or the cultural norms, all the religious norms, which restricts people to having a more access to the other people. I think in our worst case scenario is still better than this stigmatization case that overruns, right? Now let's go on to one by one who O comes up or talked about. O comes up and talked about how people will be stigmatization, but it's still better because in our side of the world, we're literally, going through this kind of process and seeing like you react to this kind of certain things which likely are going to be stigmatize you to a certain extent. That means you have a more moral burden to behave good, so that the next time you go through this test, you have a better morality. That is the incentive that people right now do not have, because if you do not do that kind of crime, if you do not go to jail, or if you are not so bad that your religious denounce you, people do not have that many checks and biases, that many checks and mechanism to be good to other people in general, right? That means for like this existence of this nation will create a check and mechanism for the existential morality for that person also, which they do not have on their side of the world. But second of all, they come up and talk to you about, these kind of things will stigmatize people and will jail and other things. So far, Shisha actually tells you why CGS system in our side of the world will have less victims, because we can now assess the violent kind of people. That means people do not, like most of the people are not psychopaths or sociopaths. That means in their side of the world, they're going to be behaving like the way they would do in their real world. That is to say the violent tendency that the people have, they will just kill another person to survive. They will just do harm to a greater extent to pass that exam, or etc., to go out of the situation. You have more checks and mechanisms as a society or as a CGS system, so that these people do not do that much harm in their side of the world. So on their best case scenario, in our worst case scenario, when these people do harm, at least these people go through this kind of rehabilitation, we have less and less number of victims. That means you do not have to check the numbers of victims to assess a person who are like, is a person bad or not. But secondly, even if that person do not do any kind of harm, as they are not doing more legitimate and real harm to the people, we are not going to put them in jail. This should talk about the rehabilitation, which comes in the form of religious rehabilitation, societal rehabilitation, and rehabilitation in general. When you go through certain kind of not jail but go through therapies and etc., are likely going to act morally, because these people have more access to this kind of people, etc. That looks like, as a person, if you fail that exam but you believe in Christianity, you go to your pastor and you check, you think that where your morality is strong based on these norms, etc. This doesn't happen on their side of the world. So if CEO comes up and talks about what about the cultural norms, what about the religious norm, we still tell you based on the universal norm, people have an incentive to be good within their religion and within their culture in general. The second thing they come up and talk to about, this is the opportunity cost and the lack of trust for the minorities in general. So far as we do not understand in our present status quo, people who are racist, people who are sexist, have the cognitive biases towards people like these people are not trustworthy. These people will not be able to do so. These are thieves because, they come from Middle East, or they come from a black ethnicity, etc., etc. I don't understand why this exclusive harm on our side of the world, but so far as they do not prove to you why like this will increase and give a certain amount of benefit to these people, let's just flip that argument. Understand, most of the people in their circumstances, even if they are black, even if they are Muslim, are not going to kill another person, because people in general are not that bad in general, even if they come from a minority. When these people have an objective result within their head, look, even if I am from minority, your racist notion do not apply to me. That means I'm not a thief. That means they have a definite answer to this kind of racism and sexism that happens in their workplace. That means these people who are racist and sexist and have already these cognitive biases cannot perpetuate these people based on this kind of things, etc., etc. But even if some people, based on their religion and based on their other things, do certain kind of crimes, we have the rehabilitation that still exists, because law do not prove to us anything, right? The last thing they come up and talk to you about, these people will trust blindly and do good, because good levels they will invest more. Answer to the Shisho's PY. Notice there's a comparative exists. That means in the status quo, when you invest certain amount of time, when you invest your your emotions and your times and etc., resources to general to a person, you tend to believe that person, but you do not have any rational belief or rational objectivity behind that decision. You people are going to believe in their relationships or in their friends more than a stranger at the status quo. That means even if like the good levels and you believe a person who is like rich, have more good morals and can put up with good things and act like good, you are not likely to be going to check this kind of things. In our side of the world, when you invest in that good level, at least you are certain that this person is not going to harm you when you are in a fight. That means in our worst case scenario, when they come up and talk about 2 or 3 mishaps do not actually define a person, and in our best case scenario, when you prove to how domestic abuse and this kind of things will lessen, because people likely to know which kind of people are in general more violent in the particular circumstances. I think in weighing, we always go to the person who always go to a machine which will like save one woman or one gender minority from this domestic abuse, as opposed to 1 or 2 mishaps, right? Before moving on to my last substantiation, Theo.
Why, look, on our side of the house, rehabilitation also can happen. There's no exclusivity. But why do you not believe in the agency for people to change for themselves, right? Why do you think this result is final and therefore justified for you to judge that based on your cognitive?
Actually, I prove to you why people in the status quo do not have that many checks and mechanism to be good in general, because they do not have any objectivity and no one can show this is your level of morality, etc. So people do not have that many incentive to be good in general. But second of all, we have to tell you in our speech like how we have less victims, and that is why the rehabilitation is better on our side of the world. You need victims, you need harm inflicted upon society to make people go through this kind of rehabilitation, which we can prevent in general. Right. The third of all, the last substantial where Shisho starts, right? In terms of policy making and politicians, look, we give so much power to politicians, we give up our rights, etc., etc. But we have to wait on the status quo. Like after voting them for 5 or 10 years, are they going to be good? Are they going to be good for the policy making or the minority in general? Insofar as they also go through these kind of processes again and again before every election, etc., etc. You have a faster result. You can vote based on that. This is legitimate because we literally give our rights to them. That is why we prove to you of our micro and macro level how this existence of VR machine is good. CG cannot go away with extension like doing like how is macro is good, how is micro is good. We just like run both of them, right? So very proud to propose this motion.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for remarks.
Panel notes that this debate is solely about why and when you are moral is something that can be reversible or not, and is something that can be permanent throughout your life. We say this debate is literally judging a book by its cover, judging a book by its statistic that this Resident Evil machine uses. We think this is bad. We think this is evil. Why this is why we're on the right side of this debate. First of all, I'm going to engage on the problem that OG is framing. That is to say, people are being subjective when it comes to them deciding if someone in their surroundings is moral or not. And then I'm gonna engage of if this is efficient enough in order to solve this problem and have more trustworthy people surrounding our our circle, right? So what they say is the following: people are subjective and they cannot actually judge enough if people are moral in their surroundings, right? We think this is entirely untrue, and we think this is something that sometimes may be good, right? So if you take into account the mitigating circumstances of someone stabbing you in the back, or rationalize why someone has done an immoral act, you can actually judge when you see the actions, and you have this feedback mechanism when it comes to if someone is worth to give a second chance or not. If you just use this kind of machine as OG frames, and CG is contingent on that use of machine of judging who is trustworthy or not, we say this is entirely bad, because this is an irreversible effect that you just label and you have a label permanent stigma upon you when it comes to you being a bad person that actually cannot be someone who is moral, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following: we think in realistic change, morality is flexible. And for that to be entirely true, we think OG concedes to that when they say you can actually be rehabbed of being immoral, right? So they subconsciously agree on the fact that morality is something that is flexible and something that can change throughout the time. Exactly because of that analysis and exactly because of that concession of OG, we think it is unfair to say that we're going to use this kind of stigmatization of this kind of echo chamber throughout the society in order to stigma and have this guilt inflicted upon these people, right? So at the end of the debate, they say, oh, this is going to be objective and this is going to be better for minorities and stuff. We say the following: Maria Elena gives you explicit framing and analysis on why people are more susceptible when it comes to them being immoral if they have been through bad circumstances, right? So if I was forced to steal bread in order to feed my children, this is something that I rationalize, and this is something that I consider myself as a moral human being exactly because I'm providing for my family. This cannot be the case for side proposition, because they don't see the harms that have been inflicted in order to make this immoral decision. They just see the result of this immoral decision, and they just label you as someone immoral. So this is why they cannot rationalize, and this is why in their side of the house you have more biases and you have more prejudice when it comes to you socializing with people and trusting people, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following: this is going to be entirely more problematic when it comes to minorities and decentralized groups, exactly because they're more susceptible to making immoral decisions. And this is something that the reason why they will probably fail this test. And this is something that people who have entrenched biases are going to probably use in order to have as evidence, in order to stigmatize and outcast this kind of people and explain why they have these biases and rationalize this confirmation bias mechanism. Then OG says, but look, we have less toxic relationships because now we know who is trustworthy and we have objective metric in order to do that. First of all, we're not entirely sure how being immoral, that is to say, betraying someone or not being in the same morality level of someone else, is something that's entirely linked with relationships, i.e. you being caring, you being able to express love, or you being there for you. I think there is some connection, but there's not explicit structural analysis why this is entirely true. But again, this is also contingent on guaranteeing the fact that these people are going to be consensual and are going to be consistent when it comes to them being moral. This is entirely problematic. OG needs to respond to that. But then we have this rehabilitation analysis. We say, first of all, this is a violation of infringement, right? Because we think you have the right to be immoral in a way, not committing crimes, but being immoral, being a jackass or an asshole. And I think you should be able to get away with it because this is your decision and you live by your consequences. I don't know why OG wants to force people to use this kind of rehabilitation. But again, what we say is that even if you buy the analysis of the metric that we need to force people to be moral, we say this is not going to be effective because of the perception. And this is why this debate comes down to. Even if you can change, and even if you are actually an immoral person that can't be moral, we say the way that people perceive you is just a label, and the way you reflect yourself and you feeling the guilt and the perception of what have I done and have killed someone throughout this machine because this is real, and you have this PTSD mechanism throughout inflicting on yourself. I think you will never be able to have maximized agency of changing your behavior, exactly because everybody's going to treat you as an outcast, and because you will not be able to rationalize why you have been forced to make this kind of decisions. I'm going to engage with CG, please.
I really don't understand your case. You needed to compare this measure with the punishes that we have in the status quo. The difference is that in my side of the house, when you kill a virtual person, the punish will not be as bad as killing a real human being in your side of the house.
Okay, we say the following. In your daily routine, most of us are lucky and we're not forced with like tremendous circumstances. We're not forced to make bad decisions. We're not forced to steal. We're not forced to betray. In this kind, in your side of the house, most people will be forced to do that, right? Most people will be forced to test their lines and to be forced to make this kind of bad decisions. We say on the first basis, this is bad for your side of the house because you're inflicting harm on people and you're making them remember what they have done in order to be able to see if they are moral or not. We think there are other alternatives to do that, such as you have critical junctions in your life when you decide to be moral or not. And I think your surroundings can actually like have a bias against you if you turn to be an asshole and they can outcast you. But I don't think and I don't see the necessity and the urgency you have in your side of the house. In your side of the house also, you have this tremendous irreversible effect that Marialena engages and OG never touches upon. This is bad. OG considers the argument when it comes to guilt, right? And when it comes to you feeling bad for yourself and you feeling susceptible to this kind of narratives, because we say that your morality is entirely entrenched on the circumstances that you feel. And we have seen this like with the banality of evil mechanism on the Second World War, right? So it is a fine line between you being forced to make bad decisions in your life and you being like at the end of the day, you've been forced to be an immoral jackass and you've been treated as much in your daily routine where you haven't made those choices. It is entirely untrue and it is entirely bad for you in order to make this kind of self-reflection, in order to have this guilt like touches upon you, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following. One, we think this you inflict harm on people that you don't need to. We have other ways to check and trust people. This is good. We think that people should have this mechanism of trusting like people and checking them around, not be like blindfold and like just trusting the ones that actually have good scores in this kind of perception. Two, we think there is an immense pressure when it comes to minorities and why this is an echo chamber that will follow you for throughout your life. This is a permanent label of you being unworthy and untrustworthy. This is entirely bad. You minimize the agency of these people of being able to actually have this kind of second chances. Three, we say this is entirely like evil when it comes to you forcing people to feel this this kind of guilt. At the end of the debate, we're very proud to be on the side of the debate.
Issues with connection, nothing that's so serious, but if for your points of information, please tell me whether you are opening or closing. And if I haven't given to you like a POI, it's probably because I'm not aware of the time. So write down if there's like 5 minutes, 30 seconds, write it in the chat and I will do my best to give you a POI. And yeah, I think that's it. Let me just give the time. Quick thank you to Sebastian. You're the man. Okay, let's go. Panel, I think it is important for us to understand why it is that we have universal values. We do them because we want to prevent certain things from happening to us. Nobody likes getting killed. Nobody likes getting their things stolen. Nobody likes being betrayed or something like that. These things are a way to ensure that these things do not happen to innocent people or do not happen to these things. The problem is that usually like the consequences that are brought upon there are only brought after the fact. And this allows the deception of evil people to remain untouched by society. Understand that the comparative in this debate is basically like this system with the already existing punitive system that you have, in which like where you commit a crime and then you go to jail. The problem with this system is that some people are not dissuaded with regards to these things because either A, you know you can get away with it, or B, you simply do not care. Therefore, a lot of people can use deception to actually get their things. And you can see this in a lot of scenarios. For instance, you can see it in serial killers, how the majority of people live a normal, average life, but at the same time, they have literal skeletons in their closet. What are we going to bring you in this debate? First of all, how there's not only more possibilities of rehab, but how this is better. And we're going to bring you the mechanizations. Secondly, how this creates a better, more empathetic criminal justice system. Now, first of all, I think that yes, this is a measure that is about prevention. But as I stated before, and as Sebastian stated, it is more likely that you're going to create more specified helps for these people. Opening government already told you how there's probably more chances to detect people and give them rehab. We're going to tell you like how it is more likely that you're going to develop some empathy with regards to this, and how that rehab is probably going to be more catered to that person's specific needs. Let's talk about what happens in the status quo. In the status quo, as I stated before, like usually a person gets punished after the fact. So after they killed someone, after they stole something, after like they ruined someone's life or something like that, what ends up happening is that you have no incentives to have empathy with that person. Why? Because if you're like the family of the person that got killed, you're probably going to be blinded by rage and by hatred and by stuff like that. And that is probably going to not allow you to feel mercy for that person. But secondly, because we as the general public usually feel more empathy for the person that is suffering, more empathy for the victim. Therefore, the majority of our decision making towards the people that commit those things are probably going to be taken with regards to hatred. I want that person to rot in jail. I want that person dehumanized. I want that person to suffer the worst possible things because they have created so much pain. In our side of the house, that person has killed a bunch of pixels in their computer. Therefore, it is less likely that we feel that amount of grief and that amount of pain, and therefore take more rational decisions. I think that it is more likely for us to empathize with those things. Therefore, there is less stigma in our side of the house because we are not blinded by grief. But secondly, and this is very important, we are also, because we are not blinded by these strong emotions, are more likely to look at the root cause of these problems. So I'm probably going to say, why did this person steal in the simulation? Oh, because he was starving to death and he needed to do this. Perhaps I'm going to do some specific affirmative action to solve this sort of problems. Therefore, we create a spillover effects in which we can actually even fix some of these moral gray areas and stuff like that. Secondly, because we break complete stereotypes with regards of based upon groups. Understand that because we still want to prevent some sort of crime in our side of the house, we're more likely to increment police presences in certain neighborhoods which are like very crime-based or something like that, or we start judging people by groups because that is like immutable characteristics that can help us identify which kind of person and which kind of person is probably not going to commit a crime. What ends up happening here is that we start like making group assertions, and that is why the majority of stereotypes are born. Because if I see that in Black neighborhoods there is more possibility of crimes, I am more likely going to think that Black people are criminal by nature or stuff like that. I believe that this actually perpetuates racist things. In our side of the house, we have the capacity of not judging people by immutable characteristics, but by the content of their character, which was what Martin Luther King vowed for. Therefore, it is more likely that you're going to have like more individualistic approaches to different peoples, and those people that are probably going to fail the test get specialized help that are probably going to need it in order for have a betterment. Now, before I continue, opening opposition, your points.
Okay, I think your case entirely contingent on the incentive that people have in order to actually check why in the circumstance that they faced, right? So like at the end of the day, if I have a good score, why I cannot just stigmatize people that have a bad score? Why I will have the incentive to actually check why they have done this mistake?
Because as I stated before, you haven't harmed anyone by having a bad score. And as the majority of this house has stated, morality is something that can change over time. So if I am taught how to redeem myself, I am probably going to have those things. So yes, maybe there's going to be a little bit of stigma, but it's less dangerous than the stigma that you have in your side of the house, in which we lock people in jail, dehumanize them, and make them probably treat them so bad that they probably even get worse when they get out of jail, in which they commit more crime, in which they have less access to opportunities and things that perpetuates crime in an endless cycle. And I think that this is absolutely bad. So what have we taught you in this debate, and why do we believe that we win? First of all, we have taught you why these things exist, which is basically because we don't want these things to happen to the majority of us. This actively prevents these things. There is no need for a crime to be committed in order for that dissuasion. In our side of the house, at least we're saving that person's life that person's property or that person's from harm. Second, because we have taught you how it is more likely that you're going to be more prone to create better catered systems for rehabilitation, which means that people are less likely to get out of jail and commit these types of crimes, because we are not blinded by grief, and we're not blinded by hatred because of these things they did, because in their side of the house, it is more likely that the harm comes from pixels that actually have no sense of feeling or anything. We're less likely to empathize with them. Third, because as we stated before, this actually evades group judgment, which is the source of all of the stereotypes that exist, which is the source of all of the historical discrimination that exists. And we start judging people by the content of their character. And I believe that this is absolutely good, because it creates a more pluralistic society in which we're more willing to comprehend, and because we also give more personalized based on what people's specific needs happen. Thank you.
I thank the member of government for his remarks, and I welcome.
CO believes that all relationships between human to another human is unique, it's special, and at the end of the day, a blanket, assessment of someone's moral does not necessarily always reflect to their actions and what they're going to do in that particular relationship, because there are externalities that decides what you do regardless of your moral, right? On CO, then, we're not going to judge people based on what they think, but on what they do, right? That's why we're still going to have criminal justice system, for example, that judges people on their actions. By the way, CG, if you want to say, oh, okay, we're going to be nicer to people who commit crimes, but, have high morals, there is already mechanism like that anyway, right? Good manners, for example, you following procedures, you, for example, contributing in jail, for example, those are good values. They're necessarily going to decrease, for example, your jail time at the end of the day. So it's not going to be that hard, and it's also going to be publicized, right? But two, if OG wants to talk about, okay, there's going to be politicians, for example, that's going to be put into test, but then there are also existing mechanism, right? Track record, for example, interviews, they're specifically designed to test values, for example, media as watchdog, that literally their job is to see, for example, whether politicians are truthful or not. But then at the end of the day, what matters then is whether their action is good, whether their action is beneficial or not what they think, right? Even if they're a little piece of trash in their action values, but their action is good, we don't have a problem, because those politicians are still going to be good anyway. If the action is judged, and the action is already judged by other metrics, right? So CO is going to fill all of the gaps in OO, right? Because OO misses its likelihood. O talks about, okay, people with bad morals are not consistently bad, and morals and actions are different, but there's no explanation how, for example, what those differences look like and why those differences matter. CO is going to be the one who contextualize, therefore giving them the ability to run their case, and also we're going to give you engagement to personal relationships and why it's good, right? So the context. One, we don't think that the results of these tests are going to come out super different, like what government says, right? That one is going to, some person is going to have 10, for example, perfect moral, the other is going to have 2, for example. Most of the time, people on the ground aren't always morally justified or morally perfect, right? It's impossible to achieve. Most of the time, people are going to be, be in very specific small spectrum, for example, between, I don't know, maybe 5 and 6, I don't know. It's going to be very hard to differentiate one person to another, right? Exactly because most people are already, socialized with those particular morals. We think then this exploration is important because OG's benefit of identification of someone being very evil or very good, for example, is not important because it is a very minuscule part of society that you don't necessarily talk about, that usually if they're really that bad, usually they're already signs, for example, there's already socialized by people talking about the idea of gaslighting, manipulation, things you need to watch for. Those are already socialized in status quo currently. So we don't think then the manipulation case of personal relationship is a case you need to care for, right? But two, even if it's bad, we think it's even worse on their side, because if they want to run the case of personal relationship is gonna be good, we're gonna say that no, they're gonna be bad exactly because you're not gonna cherish small moments. You're gonna it reduces these unique relationships into, you know, specific caricatures, because you're very aware, for example, that these people are inherently, okay, their test says that they're gonna steal from me, therefore I'm gonna be super aware, for example, and I'm not gonna open myself to them, for example, because I don't want to get stolen. It's gonna decrease the amount of relationship. I'm gonna explain to this later, right? But what I'm gonna explain first is why actions are dictated through not just morals, but also externalities, right? Okay, OG explained that the test will come in the form of scenarios, for example. People are gonna get, you know, people are gonna be put into tests of whether they're gonna do a certain action or not, right? The problem is that the test might be accurate, but it's not gonna be reflective to real world life scenarios, right? Why? Because actions is not just, it's a combination of what you believe in and what your external situation tells you, for example. This looks like someone who might score, for example, the upper level of the test might still have a tendency, for example, to kill, for example, or might have a tendency to unneededly, they didn't kill on purpose, for example, because of something that happens externally, for example. They might necessarily, misstep and they made a wrong decision and therefore they kill someone at the end of the day, or they cause a certain harm, right? Similarly, a poor person or someone who is inherently, more scores on the lower spectrum are not gonna necessarily want to always kill all the time. They're necessarily gonna, still have restraint, still understands the externalities and so on and so forth. The problem is that prejudice exists, right? Exactly because of this particular accurate testing. So it means that in a murder scene, for example, when someone who scores 7 accidentally kills someone, for example, the person who scores 4 is more likely gonna be put to jail, more likely gonna go to the tough interrogations, for example, even if they didn't do it. It means that the criminal justice system is gonna be heavily reliant on this test to the point where they discredit other externalities that might necessarily happen that might criminalize the wrong people or people who do not necessarily deserve it, right? But moreover, let's engage with the idea of stereotypes, right? We think the reason why stereotypes exist is not because of their universal moral that is being, that these people have, but because of cultural differences, right? Black people, for example, is seen as very loud, for example, very rude. These are not things that are universally seen as good. It's just that their culture thinks so. And by the way, these cultures are not tested, for example. So it means that the differences of culture that creates this racism at the end of the day still exist on government side, exactly because they don't necessarily, it's not a strong enough change. It's still an ingrained part of society that doesn't necessarily isn't tackled by this particular universal morals, right? Before I move on, OG.
Yeah, so your case is still uncomparative because even in your world, you only consider a thief as a thief, and minorities still face more harms. At least in our world, you recognize the circumstances in which this person is doing this because you know he's a moral person, and therefore you tackle societal and cognitive biases like race better. Engage.
Yeah. The problem then is that on your side, when someone of the minority, for example, is inherently given this test and they're, necessarily do not necessarily fall, the test exists, they're still gonna get discriminated anyway. But now there's another layer of discrimination exactly because there's another test, for example, that they might fail, and thus solidifying, for example, the already existing cultural differences, making them even harmful, right? But lastly, let's talk about the idea of, why a relationship is gonna be unique. We think relationship from one person to another is unique exactly because someone is not always going to be mean to another person, right? It's most likely they're going to be, mean to X, but for their child, for example, their loved ones, they're going to be really, really nice, for example, because they love that person. There's another variable in that particular relationship. The problem with this particular motion, it discredits that unique relationship, makes it seem like the relationship doesn't matter, for example, because the person who engages with the person will say that, oh, I don't want to engage with with this guy because I see the test shows that they're always gonna hit me, for example, always gonna steal at the end of the day. This means that the chance of them to change is gonna be less than very proud to oppose.
Sorry. I thank the member of opposition for his remarks, and I call upon the government whip to close off the gov case. You're here.
One, first of all, some clarifications about the comparative on this debate, and second, the clashes of this debate. Let's go with the comparative. I think that the opposition bench framed the status quo as in the present, we were like super benevolent with people who have killed, who have stolen, or who have infringed the universal norms. This is not true. In the status quo, when you steal, you suffer. You already suffered the stigma of being in prison. You already suffered the stigma of killing someone in real life, not a virtual person. You're sentenced to a life prison because of something irreversible that you will never be able to undo. I think that it is fundamental to know that it is a lot better, and Andres and absolutely no one else in this debate explain to you why our preventive system, why our occasional system is better in the reality. There are two clashes on this debate. The first one is in which side of the house we have a better justice system. The second clash goes around in which side of the house we have a better reparation in the long term. Let's go with the first class, in which side of the house we have a better justice system. And let's start firstly with the extension, because I think that my opening feel a lot of things. First of all, I think that my opening didn't explain what is the context in which we live right now, in which a lot of criminals are undetectable, in which a lot of people who are raping their own kids or who are killing their own family are undetectable. I think that this kind of urgency and need that my opening didn't mention is highly dangerous. But the second point is that my opening didn't mention why we have universal moral norms. And I think that all the opposition bench went to this point about the relativization of morality. Panel, morality can change. Do you know what principles have remained unchanged throughout the debates? The moral universal norms, the moral of the dignity of people, the moral of not killing, the moral of not stealing. I believe that when you are in a simulation and I don't know, you rape a kid, or if you are in a simulation and you kill someone that trusted in you, I believe that there are a lot of higher chances of dangerous things in the side of the house of the opposition. Let's go with some rebuttals. What does closing opposition says? Firstly, they go with this weird point about minorities and a lot of biases. First of all, I think that the opposition bench is being a victim of the bias, and I think because they're assuming that minorities will score higher in this test, I think that this is not true. But second of all, I think that the majority of people who are being killed in the status quo are transsexual people, are Black people, are people from minorities. I think that these irreversible damages that we are creating in the status quo are victims of this biases, because recognize that the stigma is symmetric on both sides of the houses. The stigma against Black people also exists in the opposition side. The stigma against transsexual people also exists in their side of the house. You know what changes in my side of the house? That we are able to protect these people, that we are able to prevent them from being killed, because if in a simulation someone killed them, if in a simulation someone tried to steal them, I think that they are better protected in my side of the house. But second of all, I think that in my side of the house we have better procedural systems, because we don't start I don't know, using police violence against a person, because I don't know, we don't start putting a person into prison, because in my side of the house we have a better system of verification. We objectively can prove if someone is going to kill another person. We're objectively going to prove that someone is going to rape another person. I think that in my side of the house this is a lot better. Let's go with the second point, and is that they basically said that bad people are really a really small amount of people. Basically, closing position said that bad people are really low. One, I think that even if bad people were a really small number, they create massive problems. They create massive insecure problems. They create harm. They rape. They kill people. They make irreversible damages to the dignity of people. I think that even in the best case scenario of opposition, when I don't know, bad people were small, I think that there are serial killers who kill 50 people before they cut. I think that there are serial killers who kill a lot of people before they cut. I think that in my side of the house, when you are not objectively killing people, but when you are killing pixels, or when you're killing an image, then you are going to make better preventive damages. I prefer my side of the house in which you are able to keep those 50 people alive, right? But second of all, I think that this is not the case. I think that bad people, or people who are going to commit these kind of crimes, are really a massive amount. I think that there are a lot of terrorist groups. I think that there are a lot of crime syndicates groups. I think that this is highly dangerous for the society, especially in the poorer context in which all the opposition bench care. I think that in my side of the house, when we are taking this measure about everyone get caught, it's better. And this is the point that opening opposition said. Opening opposition said that in the virtual world, we are forcing people to steal or to kill, right? I think that people, the first point of rebuttal, I think that people in the real life don't choose their own personal experiences. This means that in the side of the house of opposition, only the people that are like in a risky situation or only people that are poor will be tested because these are the people that in the comparative, like, you know, will have these kind of situations. In my side of the house, everyone will get tested. In my side of the house, everyone will have this kind of tests. I think that this will make like the crime or the like the morality is better in the comparative. Before I go on those closing, have a POI. 3.
Why do you think on your side that people who would necessarily test low is gonna be people who are not part of the minority?
Okay, like you're saying that, for example, people who are going to test low are going to be like, you know, in prison. One, I think that in my side of the house, as Andres mentioned, we're going to do a better research process. We're going to analyze why these people committed the crime. It doesn't exist in your side of the house, because in your side of the house, in a lot of situations, we are not able to prove why the people committed the crime. In my side of the house, we have the whole recorded virtual situation. We analyze why these people stole. If they are poor, we analyze why these people betrayed. If they're I don't know, like if they have some risky situations. In your side of the house, we're actually counting people without being able to have the complete information of what of having this. But second of all, I think that in my side of the house, we will be able to prevent these irreversible damages. And I think that this is very important, panel. In both sides of the houses, there are going to be criminals. In both sides of the houses, there are going to be bad people. But what changes in my side of the house is that people will not have like these bad sentiments or bad emotions throughout these people. Why? Because in the side of the house of the opposition, people are killing real people. In the side of the house of opposition, people are stealing real people. This makes the feelings of wanting to hurt the other. This makes the feeling of like, for example, of remorse a lot higher in the side of the house of the opposition. I think that the preventive system that we have is a lot better than the punitive system that we have in the status quo. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Yes.
Okay, cool. My preferred POI method is through the Zoom raise hand feature through the chat. I can't see your camera. I can't see individual cameras, so just those two. Okay. Please don't unmute yourself. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One clarification before I go to my responses, right? First of all, I think that the comparative that exists in the current status quo is that we always have preemptives, right? Human nature have like a inherent need to be cautious of possible harms. That's why we have moderated laws, revisable, and they will change according to the course of time. There are preemptive in the current status quo to make sure that you don't do crimes. For example, you have the police who are constantly doing surveillance. You have like teachers in preschool teaching you norms to make sure that at the basic, at the most very young age where it's going to shape your future, you don't do bad things. You have the media to check the past precedents of politicians and how they're doing. And you also have peer groups to make sure that none of your friends are toxic. You already know probably how this works on your own, right? So I don't think it's that bad. I believe people have common sense. And I believe that this is the most realistic case in the current status quo. We don't have to leave an extreme case where everyone is gullible. Well, everyone will simply interact with everyone regardless of the red flags they give you, right? So two important contributions I want to highlight from my team, right? The fact that we told you that moral perfection is impossible and inhumane, which tells you that you will suffer from distrust towards everyone. You will like suspect your friend who even has like a perfect score of 8, for example, that is pretty higher because you already know that they have an inherent mistake. This is the prerequisite and the most likely explanation regarding the harms that happens on their self-doubts. Because, for example, like OG harm regarding how you have bad friendships, CG harm regarding how you're going to have a bad criminal justice system, this happens and we explain to you because you have a more inherent harm where you do not trust anyone. You always see and believe that everyone has mistakes, right? But second of all, we're also the team that explains to you you how actions will translate from morality. The case is because we have basic sense, we have surveillance, we have all these other existing systems, these do not always happen. And even worse, sometimes the best people will do harms. You will kill someone if you are the two people left on the Titanic, right? You have no other choice but to defend yourself. This proves to you that we are the team that gives the proportional example and the most realistic solvency to an existing problem, right? That's why the likelihood of our case is much better than any other team that exists. But I'm still going to engage one by one, right? Let's talk about OG first. OG tries to bring to you the argument regarding better social connections, right? I have three responses to this. First of all, there's no explanation regarding the urgency as to why people are that gullible and suffer that much harm from personal creations, right? We believe that people have basic logic, they have observation skills, they have socializing experience. The key element in our case and the key element in CO when you talk to you about personal connections is the element of experience in which you're able to differentiate and decide for yourself what kind of friends you want to make and what kind of connections you want to grow upon, right? We believe that under on their safe house, they're going to be super lenient where you rely entirely on this system and this metric for you to decide what kind of friends you have made. That's even more dangerous because then if an error in the system happens, then you're going to experience the harms anyway. Second response is that since a perfect result is impossible, it's going to be even worse because they're going to be overly wary of the mistakes that the other party makes, right? If you know that they have a tendency to lie, if you know that they have a tendency to steal things, you're going to be overly wary of them. And this directly negates their benefit because we believe that in relationships, you need a level of truthfulness and you need a level of trust for you to have like meaningful friendships and meaningful connections. You need to be able to trust them. You need to be able to know that you depend on them the same way you depend on them. Frankly, I don't care if my college friend would kill someone like in a zombie apocalypse, but what I care about is whether or not they're willing to discuss with me on lessons and subjects that I get at school, right? But third response is that even if it's true that you have like weird social connections, we like that because we understand that that means that you start on a clean slate with everyone, avoid of everything else like racism and everything. That means that on everyone, you learn their responsibilities individually. And this is much better because people are going to be responsible for their own. One, you don't get unfair accusation because, for example, I had that experience with someone with an 8 score, then therefore I will like blame and be super wary of everyone else with an 8, but I also don't get the unfair benefit that is like super harmful, right? So I think that all in all, that case cannot stand. But second of all, when they talk to you about there's no check and balance because there's no incentive to be good in the current status quo, this is just not grounded. Literally, there's so many benefits for someone to become good and kind in the current status quo. And there are 3 reasons why. First of all, we have indoctrination from young, right? All our teachers tell us in children, even though we don't know the manifestation, is that you have to be kind, you have to be mindful of other people. Literally, no one tells you to do crimes and like do other chaos, right? We think that therefore there's already preemptive. Second of all, you will do betterment and you will not act upon immoral things because you want better treatment from society. Exactly because you understand that killing people gets you to jail, you will not do that, right? But third of all, you have a better self-defense, right? Because understanding that people's behavior towards you will commonly mirror yours in the current status quo, right? I don't think that anyone, for example, if they want other people to be nice to them, then they will also be nice to other people. It's that simple. We believe in people's common sense, right? Their point regarding rehabilitation is not exclusive. That also happens in the current status quo, right? But the key element that happens and as to why rehabilitation is getting more and more popular is because we understand it happens to everyone. We don't base it on Resident Evil scores. We base it on the common understanding that bad morality and the incapacity to understand the universal moral, it's something that happens to everyone. It's something that's vulnerable, not something that you can instantly solve. But sure, if OG has any points.
Yeah, so all you do is mitigate, but debates are about comparatives. All of your mechanisms still exist in our world, but people can still do bad things and get away with it. People still have cognitive biases. What is the exclusive harm of our case? We mitigate a lot of your harms.
Interesting. I would engage with that if you gave a comparative and like any kind of moderation in your case to what happens in the current status quo. Because in your case, I see that people are super gullible, people are super extreme, they rely on everyone else for everything, right? And lastly, regarding policy, and I think that there's like a certain degree of this even in CG case regarding criminal justice system, right? There's not enough process analysis. Is it going to be used to filter out people who are allowed to be voting? Is it going to be used to filter out political parties to select their candidates? Because obviously political parties are going to choose the candidates with the best best scores, right? They're not going to randomly choose someone who has a bad precedence and everything, right? But more specifically, if we understand that there is a constant in which there will always be people who have the worst scores, we think that the tendency in the current status quo is that politicians are going to use them as scapegoats. Politicians are going to punish them even more and label them as something that cannot be solved, right? Because they don't want to take on that extra burden, right? I think that that's a real harm that happens. The more important, so like OGK has a Shiki problem is not grounded, right? Because currently laws are not based off common humans. They are based off laws and regulation, and they are made by experts in different fields that understand the intricacies of crime and understand that people have different externalities that lead them to certain things, right? That's why it may seem lenient, but it is perfectly contextualized to what happens in the status quo. In the status quo, people actually want harsher laws because they feel like people are not punished enough, right? In the current status quo, there's different contexts. Laws are already made where they're allowed to reduce your punishment if you're seen as someone who commonly does not do that things. If you're someone underage, if you're someone with other disabilities, then therefore we don't think that any problem by government is that severe. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker and all of the speakers.